not too many people have the mics now, or the earphones, as a matter of fact. What we'll do now is the following. We'll ask the representative, the senior representative of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Mr. Czion, to speak now in English, okay? So I hope that everybody understands English. He will speak sort of slowly with the, so that he will be understood by everybody. And then we'll make a short break for everybody to go out. Those who need earphones will get their earphones, okay? And then we will reconvene because the next speaker will be again, the Russian representative. He will speak later on in Russian, as you asked. So thank you very much for your patience. I'm sorry about the mishap, and I'm very glad to have on the podium Mr. Czion, the senior representative of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Israel and the chief of the planning division of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Mr. Czion, please.
Good morning, everybody. First of all, an apology on behalf of my Director General, Ambassador Rafael Barak, who was supposed to be the speaker. He also had a long night alongside Minister Ya'alon and others. So he asked me this morning to take over, and I'll try to do my best. I want to thank the INSS and, of course, the Russian delegation, the Russian ambassador, for the opportunity to speak here. And my subject is global trends. The slides are in Hebrew. I'll speak in English, and I hope everybody understands, even without the electronics. In the Foreign Ministry, in the last 4 years, we have conducted an unprecedented process of strategic net assessment. This is a process that was originally invented in the Pentagon, and basically covers the areas of intelligence assessment, a critical assessment of one's own policy, and an assessment of the resources that are potentially available for addressing the challenges and opportunities as they arise from the intelligence assessment and the assessment of our own policies. In other words, the strategic response. We've done it for the last 4 years on an annual basis. And what I'm sharing with you now is the declassified version of the global part of this assessment. Of course, there's a regional part, and there are other parts that I don't have the time, and it's not exactly the right forum to address. So when we speak about global trends, first and foremost, and here I think I share some of the observations made by the head of the Russian delegation, we see a very significant change both in the nature of power and in the dispersion of power on the global arena. And by this we mean what is now more and more a colloquial term, a G0 world. This is a term that was coined by Ian Bremmer, the head of the Eurasia think tank in Washington. And it alludes to the fact that the power of governments, globally speaking, is eroding. Why? Because there are other non-state actors, non-governmental actors of various kinds who are finding themselves more and more in a position of influence on the global arena as compared to governments. Governments were always there, almost always, depending on how far back you want to investigate. They're still here and they're here to stay. But the relative balance of power between the G forces, i.e. the governments, and the non-G forces is changing very rapidly and very significantly. Non-governmental actors, NGOs, non-state actors in the form of terror organizations and others, global corporations, financial organizations, and so on and so forth, are playing a much more significant role and are presenting more and more challenges in front of governments, and this is really one of the more significant overarching trends in terms of the global scene. Secondly, what we see on the G level, we see a dispersion of power. In other words, this is obviously no longer a unipolar world, nor is it even necessarily a multipolar world in the former sense of the word. The dispersion is immense, and it's not only on the global level, it's on the regional level, on the national level, and it's not only horizontal, it's also vertical, thank you. Vertical in the sense of various spheres of power. Defense, policy or diplomacy, economic, other ways and means of soft power, even cultural influence. They're all being dispersed in a very significant way on the global arena. Next in line, and if we go a little one floor below the level of global powers, and when we speak about global powers, we speak about the US, we speak about Russia, we speak about the EU, and we speak about China. These are the global powers. For those of you who are wondering where is India, we don't think that India is there yet. It may get there. It's a different presentation about India and its own strategies and so on, limitations and so on. But we look at the US, China, Russia, and the EU. Below that, we see an array, a very interesting array, which is very dynamic, of regional powers with global influence, or at least with aspirations to have global influence. And there we see, in our region, countries like Turkey and Iran. In South America, we see Brazil. In Africa, we see South Africa. And arguably, you can add to this distinguished group countries like Indonesia and perhaps a few others. And I don't want to belabor the point. The point is that we're now dealing with middle powers, if you will, with global ambitions and with global capabilities, at least in some spheres of power and influence. Now, in this increasingly complicated global system, we are no longer speaking or analyzing or facing only cross-cutting alliances in the old form of the Warsaw Pact versus NATO. We're now seeing a much more dynamic and fragile configuration, which is changing again very rapidly, of what the Americans call, and we adopt, ad hoc coalitions. Any two countries can be in a coalition at any given moment for or against a particular issue, and at the very same time, these very same two countries can be in a different coalition against each other, in different two coalitions against each other. Case in point, US and Pakistan. Think about the complicated relations between US and Pakistan. On some issues, they have an ad hoc coalition. On others, they are, it is not for me to define, but some would say adversaries. Think about the US and Egypt. President Obama was asked during the campaign in one of the debates, is Egypt an ally? And he gave an elaborate answer, which basically said, yes, in some respects, not necessarily in other respects. From an Israeli perspective, this is extremely significant. And I don't have the time, and this is not the subject of the presentation today, to speak about our foreign policy and the kind of adaptations that we need to make. But I will just very quickly say that we aspire to adapt to this kind of a dynamic. And we also want to get better in working in different coalitions, different ad hoc coalitions, which is not something that is very much a characteristic of Israeli diplomacy or foreign policy in the past. Next in line, when we think about the very basic building block of the international system, i.e. the nation state, we see that those nation states are increasingly challenged. They're challenged from the external environment, along the lines that I briefly described, And they're also challenged from within, from elements within the societies that are challenging the nation state. Of course, this is not new, but it is also getting more complicated because of the empowerment of groups and individuals driven by technology and some other global trends. I will try to go very quickly because I don't have enough time to cover all the different trends that we covered here, and I'll try to focus on what I think is most pertinent to an Israeli-Russian discussion. The two blocks that are next in the sequence here, one of them has to do with religion. It's a Hebrew word which is relatively new, hadata, which means religionization, if you will. I don't know how you can translate it to Russian. And it means basically that there is a process of increased influence of religious institutions and religious elements in the sphere of strategy and policy and global trends and global influence. And again, as diplomats and as governments, we find that we have to deal more and more with this element, which hasn't been as influential in recent decades, if you want, as it is now becoming. And I think this is global, and I think this is pertinent. Example of that is Islam and political Islam and the various trends within Islam, which Minister Yalon referred to very briefly. Political Islam is obviously one of the most important trends, not only regionally, and how do we as Israel, and how does Russia, and how does Israel and Russia together deal with political Islam, is probably one of the most strategically important challenge that both of our countries face. And of course, not only us. We have to be very careful to distinguish between political Islam in the, let's say, the more benign sense, and radical Islam in the sense of Al-Qaeda and those extreme elements, both on the Shia and the Sunni side of the equation, that preach violence and exercise violence. And again, one of the critical issues, and this is not a new issue, but I would submit is becoming more and more important, is where do you draw the line between what is legitimate political Islam and what is illegitimate. And I would suggest, I would not be part of the discussion, unfortunately, but I would suggest that this is something that the two sides discuss, because this is a very critical issue. What is legitimate and what is not? Where do the lines of legitimacy, where are they drawn? Next in line is a term coined by Zbigniew Brzezinski, global political awakening. There is a major phenomena which every citizen, I guess, and every person in this room feels, of global political empowerment by individual citizens, driven again by technology, driven by other issues, which I won't elaborate on right now, but we would say, again, as strategic planners looking at global trends, that this is probably, again, one of the most, if I had to enumerate, if I had to eliminate this long list here to maybe 5 top global trends, this would be certainly among the top 5 and arguably even maybe number 1. This is critically important. The fact that now every individual, through technology, through social networks, and through other means, is able to be active politically. I remember Tom Friedman in one of his early books spoke about super empowered individuals through technology and again through other means. Everybody now is potentially super empowered. And this has an enormous effect on everything that governments do. I will skip some of them. How much time do I have, Maeve? 10 minutes, okay. Let me speak about the Millennium Development Goals and the environmental issues that are also very critically important on the global scene. Again, from an Israeli perspective, we have a very full plate. Again, Minister Yalon, our Prime Minister, our Cabinet sat all night on a very painful, critical, strategic issue. And these are the type of issues, these conflicts, military conflicts, politico-military conflicts, have been, of course, the main feature of Israeli policy since its inception, even before. But what we're finding now more and more, and this is not only an Israeli perspective, this is again a global perspective, and I think this is also something that Russia and Israel should speak about together, is that there is now a merger between the old threats, the classic threats of terrorism, non-proliferation, and so on and so forth, and the new threats, which are softer in nature, which are longer in terms of their fruition, of the environmental challenges. And they're now becoming more and more visible. Case in point, immigration. Immigration from Africa driven by environmental issues, by global warming, by food shortage, by water shortage, and so on and so forth, is creating imminent threats for Israel. And those immigrants that are passing through Sinai are encouraging the buildup of networks of terrorists and locals which are finding common interests and are creating a very severe problem for Israel, which ultimately has to do with what we're witnessing in the last days in the conflict between Israel and Hamas and the Egyptian involvement. It comes together in unprecedented ways. And this is not the last demonstration of this convergence. On the positive side, I think Israel is globally recognized as a country that has unique assets when it comes to dealing with those new challenges of food shortage, water shortage, and energy, and the nexus between them. We have a huge relative advantage, and I think also this is something that Israel and Russia can find a lot of common ground and a lot of potential for cooperation on. I want to move on to some of the tools that the global community is finding more and more effective when it comes to dealing with traditional threats. And I'm coming to sanctions. I'm quite sure the Iranian issue will be heavily discussed. I didn't see the exact agenda. And I remember in conversation with Russians in this capacity and in previous capacities in the National Security Council, Russia had a very strong opinion when it comes to sanctions. And the bottom line was, it's ineffective. I think what we're seeing now, with respect to Iran, with respect to Syria, with respect to other countries, and I think this is not an Israeli revelation, this is a global revelation of the global system, that sanctions can be effective. And we believe that this is critically important to continue and develop as a very effective tool for countering both traditional and non-traditional threats. And of course, this should be discussed further between Israel and Russia. Proliferation, I'll pass on it quickly because I'm quite sure it will be discussed. I want to speak about what we call the transparent world. Diplomacy is based, among other things, on the ability to create a barrier and a separation between what you speak about, discuss, and agree upon within closed room and what you speak about outside. In our professional terms, we distinguish between diplomacy and public diplomacy. What is happening now, as a result, again, of technological advancement and of cultural changes in the political environment, is that this distinction or dichotomy between the open and the closed, the public knowledge and discreet or secret, is becoming increasingly blurred. And the world is becoming increasingly transparent. We need only to think about WikiLeaks. We can think about issues, very secretive issues that were discussed in Israel a couple of years ago and were revealed on TV just a couple of weeks ago. And this is a new reality for decision makers, for diplomats, for strategists to deal with. And in that sense, it's also very much a new world. And the distance between what is discussed secretly and what is out in the open is very rapidly shrinking. We have a whole block on the global economic crisis, which I will skip. And I will go very quickly to the last 2 points. Involvement of global powers in regional conflicts. Obviously a major issue for Russia and Israel to be discussing. And this is extremely interesting to watch, to understand, and to try to cope with, also in the very immediate context of Gaza right now. I think, and of course this is still in the making, I think what we are witnessing now is a new dynamic between the global arena and the regional arena. And we saw it earlier in Libya. We are seeing it still in Syria. And this is a new dynamic. And what do I mean by that? We used to have, in terms of conflict resolution, conflict management, we used to have the type of dynamic, to speak very crudely and very quickly, of somebody, a global actor, usually the Americans, but not always, being able to come into a conflict at the critical point and basically resolve it, at least temporarily. This is becoming increasingly difficult. And because of the issue I spoke about earlier, the new balance of power between global and regional, we're now seeing that regional actors are becoming more and more important. And what is happening now, and we don't know exactly, of course, what will happen in the coming days and weeks with respect to the current crisis, is a new dynamic between the global powers and the regional powers. And I think, again, this is a classic issue for Russia, a global power, and Israel, a regional power, to discuss. Lastly, multi-crisis world. The world is becoming increasingly abundant with various crises. We feel it as Israel. It's not entirely new to us, but it's becoming increasingly complex. I'm not sure about the Russian perspective. It's also interesting to listen to. But I think globally speaking, if I try to think about the American perspective, the European perspective, there's simply too much to handle. And the issue of prioritizing and creating new ways and means to deal with local, regional, global conflicts is becoming more and more difficult to manage. This, of course, will be a major challenge for the next American administration, for the Russian administration, for Israel, and for others. I'll skip this one. A word about Israel-Russia, and with this I'll finish. In 2006, I believe, when Putin came to Israel, when was it, Yaakov? 7. I was Deputy Director of the National Security Council, and Prime Minister Sharon asked us to do a very thorough work on Israel-Russia. And we did it for a number of months, and we presented it to the cabinet. Unfortunately, after Sharon was hospitalized, it was almost as a placeholder. And of course, I cannot reveal everything. It was about 80 PowerPoint slides. But what we came up with was the conclusion that Israel and Russia have a lot of common interests. Now, a lot has changed since 2007, but a lot has remained. And if I were to do a similar project now, I think I would find that, yes, there is a lot of common interest. And I hope through this discussion and others, Israel and Russia will be able to cope together with some of the challenges. Thank you very much.